Welcome back to another episode of the Supply Chaney podcast, and I am your host, Nathan Chaney. And today we're going to talk about the real deal in the weeds trucking business here with Steatson Spinks, who has recently joined on to the Supply Chaney team as our oversized heavy haul specialist on the team. Gonna let him do a little bit more introduction of himself.
Well, thank you for having me, Nathan. I do appreciate it. So I've been around trucking my entire life, and it kind of started with hey, can you haul this? And I'm like, sure, let's figure it out. And it just went from there. And we've moved some pretty big stuff. I've been up to 11 axles, steerable dollies, things like that. I pull a stretch trailer now. I run on 6 axles. I can scale about 70,000 pounds. So
Tell us a little about what you did. How did you get into trucking? What did you do when you were younger? Whenever you were in high school, what did you want to grow up and be one day?
So I wanted to be a mechanical engineer, and
Okay.
I fascinated with the way things work. I've always been around trucking. Like I said, my dad is I'm fourth generation truck driver on my dad's side, and anyways, I would go with him on the weekends, and I started driving a truck really young. I started goosenecking right out of high school, and anyways, I ended up going to college. And while I was in college, I'm like, man, I really want to get back into trucking. So I went to work for a guy for a little bit, and then I bought my first truck, and it's just kind of progressed from there. Um, so I've expanded up to 5 trucks at one point, and like I said, I'm back down to running one now, and at one point I had to decide, do I continue with engineering and be in an office all day, which I'm not a big fan of, or do I do something that I enjoy and make pretty decent money and get to ride around in a cool truck? And I opted for the cool truck.
There was a point in time when I was in high school and I was going through that phase of having loud speakers in my car and like bass and all this sort of stuff, and it was like loud music part of my life. And
Yep.
and I had this little dream that I wanted to be a truck driver and have the coolest sound system and just be able to drive all around the country with the coolest sound system. That would be my job. So you've grew up around it, like you're it's not a new concept for you for sure.
So I grew up riding, like I said, I grew up riding with my dad. I was shifting a truck by like 4 years old. I would stand between the seats. I'm 6'4" now, so obviously that's not an option anymore. But anyways, I started shifting between the seats, and then sitting in the passenger seat, I would shift with my left hand, and it just went from there. My dad hauled a lot of cattle, and that's kind of where I got my start. And it was there'd be a line of trucks, and hey, move that truck up and back up to the chute, and then it was like, oh well, we're gonna run these pasture cattle. Let's just run over here, and it just kind of proceeded from there. It's been a really awesome experience. I've learned a lot, and that's something that I truly believe in, that a lot of people don't get that opportunity anymore to actually learn from experienced people. Trucking school is mandated now, and it doesn't give you the experience and the real world application that growing up
Right.
around it does. So
Right.
I feel very blessed in that manner.
We haven't really talked about where you grew up. You've mentioned some ranching and cattle and stuff, but what part of the country are you from?
So I grew up in South Texas, a little town called Sutherland Springs. The guy that my dad was working for at the time was out of Lavernia, which is the next town north of there, south of San Antonio. Um, anyways, it's just a little ranching farming area.
Yeah.
He owned a bunch of land, and it worked out great. I mean, it was I got to haul hay on his property, things like that.
Yep.
It was
Yep.
awesome. So
I,
um,
I grew up out in East Texas, out in farm country, and I got to spend lots of summers throwing square bales of hay up on trailers out in the fields, and we had a little bit of land, and so we did a little bit of hay and cattle on our land, and my first driving experience was on a Ford 8N tractor. Right, that was the first thing I ever got to drive in my life. Although I admit I still cannot drive a stick to save my life. So you've got me beat in that category hands down for sure.
So that's awesome. I actually the very first thing that I did as far as pulling trailers and things like that was driving an old Chevrolet pickup. I can't tell you the year model. I think it was like an '86
Uh-huh.
old square body Chevrolet pickup in a field, and I was the youngest. I think I was like 4 or 5, and they're like, "Hey, drive in a straight line. We're gonna load hay," and that's
Yeah.
what we did. My dad and all his
Wow.
friends were out there throwing hay on the trailer, and we get to the field, turn around, and do it again. So.
You threw out a word a while ago, goosenecking, I think. And so one of the things that's kind of unique, I guess, about the Supply Chain podcast is there's people from across the industry, from people who just do demand planning and project management and warehousing and distribution and manufacturing that maybe are not familiar with the different modes of transportation and maybe some of like the different slang terms for what those modes are or something when it comes to trucking. You care to give us like a little digest of, from goosenecking to, LTL and oversized, kind of give us a little rundown of the dictionary of terms there?
Okay, so goosenecking is more commonly referred to as hot shot. I refer to it as goosenecking because I was referring to cattle at the time, and
Hmm.
that's just kind of what we call hot shot in the cattle industry is goosenecking. It's
Okay.
using probably a 1 ton to ton and a half pickup pulling a gooseneck trailer. Um, I've never really done much with LTL. I'll be honest with you there. I
Yep.
do understand what it is, but I'm not very well versed in it. And so I've pulled from goosenecks, like I said, all the way up to 11 axles with steerable dollies. So that configuration, it was a three axle truck, yeah, three axle truck, three axle trailer, and then it had a pivot turntable on it, and the load was actually the majority of the trailer, and then five axle dolly behind it, and it was steerable. So um, that's kind of my experience. I've done all the way from the little bitty stuff all the way to the pretty decent sized stuff. It's not the big stuff, but it's pretty decent.
Sure. Well,
So
what do you consider big stuff if 11 axles is not really big?
there's trailers that are dual lanes. They're big platform trailers. They're dual lanes because they cover two lanes of the road,
Uh,
and I mean that most of those trailers are 200,000 pounds empty, just the trailer itself.
yeah.
And my truck
And like $1 million, right?
at
Like
least, yes, like
for the
starting,
trailer.
yes, just for the trailer is like $1 million. So
Yeah, yeah.
that's big stuff in my mind. The stuff that I do is, I mean, I was 137 feet long, and that probably seems astounding to most people. The average truck's like 65 feet long. So,
Yeah.
but to me, it's still little. It's not my end goal. I want to get to that big stuff.
Gotcha, gotcha. Well, so now tell us a little bit about the truck that you've got behind you.
So this is a '94 model Peterbilt. I bought it 7 years ago. I've rebuilt it from the ground up. The only thing that's still original is the rear axles and the frame, and that's not going to be for much longer. I'm fixing to change that. It's got a Detroit in it, 13 speed, and it's my pride and joy. It's custom paint, and it is exactly what I want.
And one thing I haven't had experience with, and a lot of folks have, which would probably be the idea of living out of your vehicle, living out of a truck, for a while because you're out on the road. Can you kind of just describe for folks that haven't ever experienced that, what that's like? What a life, what a day in the life of a over the road sort of driver, or someone that's not coming home at the end of the night is like.
So first off, it can be difficult. I will share that. The longest I've ever spent in the truck is 33 days, and I mean, you live out of a suitcase, so everything
Yeah,
when you leave the house, everything that you need for that month, you've got to take with you. And people often forget about laundry detergent, things like that. You've got to find a place to do your laundry.
yeah,
Most of the time, I don't stay in motels. I've got my sleeper there. I would prefer to sleep in my own bed, and
yeah.
and there's a lot of truck drivers that when they refer to sleeping in their own bed, they mean in their house. And I'm like, well, I own that bed too. So, um, so I prefer to sleep in my truck. Believe it or not, I get better sleep in my truck than I do pretty much anywhere else. It's
Yeah,
peaceful to me.
yeah,
Um, it's a confined space, so one thing I do to make it better for me is at least once a day I sit down and I eat what I call a real meal. I want to sit down
yeah.
in a restaurant. I want to interact with people, little things like that. It's beautiful. I've seen quite a bit of the country from the truck. I really like trucking in the fall. But right now it's perfect time. I like to see all the fall colors and
Yeah.
see the first snow, things like that. It's really enjoyable. For somebody that likes to travel, it's really nice.
Right.
If you like routine and whatnot, then over the road is not really for you.
But it also there's a special, there's two kinds of traveling truck, right? There's the one that backs up to a dock, gets unloaded or gets loaded, goes to another dock, gets unloaded, and almost doesn't really ever need to touch a single thing. But that's not the case for kind of project oversized, overdimensional type drivers. Can you kind of tell us a little bit about what's involved? You as the driver, what your responsibility is when it comes to oversized loads.
So my biggest thing, regardless of what, no matter what you're doing with trucking, is be on time. Uh, there's usually doing what we do. Everything is pretty much crane on, crane off. So the crane is very expensive. So you want to be there on time. You want to have everything set up. I put my chains out, my binders out. I kind of have an idea as to what I'm going to use for the load, and I get everything set out. I get my trailer stretched if I'm going to be stretching it out, which is a simple process. You pull a lever and you pull the trailer apart. It's not very difficult, but it's still time consuming. Sometimes you got to get the measurements right. Just get your signs, your flags, things like that in order. Pull her on the crane, chain it down, get out of the way for the next guy to do it. We have to pull permits. Depending on what it is, if I've hauled it multiple times, I'll go ahead and order permits ahead of time. If it's something new, I wait, I get all my measurements for sure as to what they are, and then I'll order permits and go from there. Um, Permits can be tricky. Texas, for example, just yesterday, I had a 195-mile load and I had 2 pages of directions. Um, so that's quite a bit of information that you've got to process and know exactly where you're going. And then when you get there, I always try to be early. Get early to your destination and keep in good communication with everybody. And sometimes you have to unload in order. Sometimes you get to unload, whenever the crane's set up, and so it's kind of reverse operations there. Undo all the changes that you can undo right before you get underneath the crane, and that way, maybe take 4 chains off while you're underneath the crane, and just stack everything on your deck, pull to the side, close your trailer up, and then put your chains away, and maintenance your chains and your binders as you go so that you don't have problems when you go to do your next load.
Yeah, yeah. So that chaining component, I guess flatbed drivers and oversize, you all are responsible for load restraint and making sure that load is secure and not coming off. And these things can be really odd sizes, really big, really heavy, like really. I think sometimes you need ladders and stuff to just get on
Yes.
top and try to just throw straps. Can you kind of describe, like, I don't know, the most difficult load that you've had to try to figure out how to strap this thing on and make it safe, on your trailer?
So I hauled a tank that was supposed to be 15.6 in diameter. When I got there, it was 16.4 in diameter, which is a big thing when you're talking multiple states. We ended up having to have police escorts and everything else, and we had to chain it. We had no, they didn't have any blocking or anything like wedges to keep the tank from rolling. So we had to have the crane hold it while we put 4 chains on it to cross chaining on it, and then they didn't have any lugs for us to chain to, so we had to take chains apart and figure things out. And we ended up, I think I put 5 straps on it, and we put 8 chains on it, 4 cross chains on either end.
And having that skill, I mean, it's a bit of an engineering skill and mindset, right? To be able to understand just how this load is going to feel and want to move, and how you restrain it from wanting to do what it wants to do. I mean, there's some skill. Is there certifications and training, I think, for that?
I believe there is training. I don't know about any certifications, but there is training, and a lot of the bigger like flatbed companies and stuff, they put on, they call them truck rodeos sometimes, but they put on these events where the senior drivers that have experience and can explain things and answer questions will get together with the younger guys, and I think that's great. I learned
Yeah.
from some older guys. Like I said, my dad had a lot of experience with oversize and things like that as well, and I've been blessed with some very good friends that have been willing to take phone calls in a kind of a nervous mindset of like, hey, I have no idea what I'm looking at. What do I do here? And it's been pretty great. Having a network is very important of people that you can trust.
for sure.
One of the guys, I actually spoke with him yesterday. I mean, he's done dual lanes and 13 axle, 19 axle, and just really big stuff. And there's been times that I've called him and I'm like, man, I am lost. What do I do? And he gives me the answer. So and
Yeah,
it's not so
yeah.
much as the answer is how to think about it. It's like you said, what direction is it trying to move? What direction do you not want it to move? And things like that. It's how you think, not exactly the answer. So.
Yeah, right, right. I mean, it's a lot of problem solving and a lot of logic and reason that you got to use out there. It's not just throwing 24 pallets in the back of a dry van and driving. So we talked a little bit about permits and how, there's a process to that, that you've got to get permits. And can you kind of explain for those not familiar, what's the purpose of having a permit? Why does this big load going down the road need a permit from Texas and Oklahoma and Arkansas? What's the purpose of that for them?
So the main thing is it gives us a route that is supposed to be safe. It keeps us from hitting bridges. It keeps us, and there is a caveat to that, but it's still ultimately the driver's responsibility to check those things. But the purpose behind them is to give us a designated safe route that they know that this load should be able to travel on. There's certain states where you have to do route surveys when you get over a certain size. Texas is one of them. Over 18 feet high, you have to have a route survey. And basically, in that situation, Texas will say, okay, here's a route that we think will work. Send somebody that can measure it and make sure that it will work. Also, I most often run overweight. And when you run overweight, they also can confirm whether the bridges can hold that. They know, they test the bridges and they know what they can
Yeah.
sustain weight wise. So I run a 3 axle truck setup instead of a 4 axle. So there's times where my drive axles, my rear axles will be heavier per axle than a 3 axle drive tractor would be. And so that means that sometimes I can't go the same route as they do because of the pounds per square inch. We have to measure tires, everything. Like they want to
Mhm.
know how the weight's distributed on the road so that it doesn't damage roads or the load or anybody else.
And so, based on your truck setup and your configuration, you may get a different route for how your load is balanced and how your truck is set up versus
Yes.
another truck. So that's part of your
Yes, sir.
permit process as well that you're having to provide.
Yes, sir.
Interesting. And then how about when you got the really larger loads, you've got escorts and utilities and police and that sort. Can you tell like how complex of a load can you possibly get?
So what I've done so far is police, pilot cars, civilian pilot cars, and bucket trucks, and it can get extremely complex very quickly. There's some states where you have to run like 3 pilot cars and police and bucket trucks, and you have to coordinate all that. And then we have what's called a CB radio in the truck. Some people be familiar with them, some aren't, and only one person can talk at a time. So you have to be constantly vigilant about who's saying what, and you have to know where that person is and what information they're feeding you because you know, usually I'll learn a person's voice and pretty quickly and as their position if I haven't worked with them before, like where their position is in relation to the load. And
Yeah.
everybody has the right to stop the job, so you have to be very careful as listening as to who's stopping it so that you know where to pay attention and to why. um,
Uh-huh.
Ultimately, yeah, when you're running a height pole, for measuring bridges, structures, you know, power lines, trees, etc., they usually are the first one to stop the load because there's a reason for it. We can't clear, you have to go to the other side of the road. You may have to lean the load on the edge of the road to clear a power line. I mean, there's a lot of thought and work that goes into it. And there's constant communication. I mean, it can be sensory overload if you're not very good at communicating with a lot of people very quickly.
You talked about bucket trucks a while ago. I get the concept, but what is the purpose of a bucket truck when it comes to trucking something down the road?
Okay, so a bucket truck, for those that don't know, is what linemen use for utilities when storms happen and whatnot. They go out and they work on the power lines, and it's literally just a truck with a boom and a bucket on it. And the purpose for an oversized load is they can lift wires. They all have to be certified electricians, and they can lift wires. They can lift light poles, like stoplights. Even there's times where we can't clear stoplights, and they can
Uh,
take that boom and put it underneath it, and they'll lift that boom or they'll lift the boom and the light up just enough that we can skim underneath it. And it gets pretty intense sometimes. I mean, when you're 18 plus feet tall, there's not a whole lot that you'll clear.
I've always looked up to the drivers that are moving the big stuff down the road because that's such a complex, task and so much involved and a hundred different sort of things that you've got going through your mind every foot you're driving down the road. And so I've asked and talked to other people who kind of basically say that heavy haul driving is kind of like the pinnacle of a driver's career. That's about the hardest task, maybe other than like ice road trucking or something like that. But it's kind of like the most demanding of your experience, of your expertise, of all that sort of stuff. Would you agree?
Yes, I would agree. Like I said, I've done several different aspects of this industry. Everything from hauling milk, which is in a smoothbore tanker, and there's a lot of weight moving, and by far, oversized is the most demanding thing that I've hauled. Um, like you said, there's so much that you've got to watch. Most of the time, my loads are wide enough that I'm in two lanes. You've got to be watching for traffic. You have to watch for things coming at you. You have to watch as you're gaining on things. Sometimes a construction sign on the side of the road that may not be anything to anybody else, you would have to move over so that you could clear it, and
Yeah.
and there's just so many things to watch all the time.
And you can't just, if you got to go to the restroom, you can't just be like, "Oh, there's a McDonald's up at the next exit. I'll go there," right? Like
Exactly.
you are way more constrained on. You've got to plan out every sort of turn and know everything about that route that you're going to take and where you're going to stop for breaks and whatnot because you just are not a normal sized vehicle, right?
We're just not going to fit. There's times that you can get with RGNs. I've never done it, but you can get hung up on even off ramps. There'll be a big transition at a stop sign at an off ramp, and you'll get hung
Uh,
up. And like you said, there's so much that you have to watch and know about and plan your route. You just can't stop anywhere.
do you have like one of those stories of like the most epic, craziest sort of, transport sort of project that you've been part of?
The wildest one is actually the tank I was telling you about earlier. It was a project with 10 tanks. I had the biggest tank, and I showed up, and everything was a complete madhouse. And there was so many people talking to different people, and it was awful. And I got with all the truck drivers and said, "Hey, I'm going to represent all of us, and I'm going to talk to the person in charge here." And they're like, "Okay, cool." So I spoke with the person in charge and said, "Hey, if you're cool with it, just go through me. Any questions you have, I'll take care of it. I'm just going to run this show because there's a game of telephone going on around here."
Yeah.
And it started with the dimensions being wrong on the loads. So, anyways, there was 10 of us. I only had my tank was 37 foot long and 16.4 in diameter. I was just over 18 feet tall, and everybody else's was the same diameter, but theirs were 30 feet long, 30 to 31 feet long, depending on which tank it was. And so, anyways, we had to get police escorts, and we were in this really remote place in Louisiana. Like the road was as wide as the truck. We're 16 feet wide coming out of there, and anyways, we all had the same permit. We were all going the same route, and we were coming out of there, and the cop called out a turn, and we make this turn, and the back like three guys were like, "I'm not going that way, that route's awful, I'm going this way." And the cop stopped everything, and he came to me. He's like, "Hey, don't we all have the same permit?" And I said, "Yes sir, we're all the same dimension, aside from me, I'm the longest, but yes, we all have the same outer dimensions, or pretty close." And he's like, "Man, what are they doing?" I'm like, "I don't know." So he's like, "Well, you're leading this show. What do you want to do?" I said, "Well, all of us are going to stay together. We're going to go." And he's like, "Okay." So we go, and we're riding along for about another 2 hours, and we ended up having to stop in the middle of the road. The cops turn sideways and block us in. And he comes back there, and he's like, "Man, I just got a call. They took out a stoplight, and it hit some lady's car and all this stuff." And I was like, "Well, maybe they should have stayed on route with us." There was six of us that ran together, and we ran from Louisiana to South Texas, and none of us had any problems. We had a great ride, and it was great. We had great pilot cars, and once we got to Texas, we no longer needed police escorts. It was a pretty fun ride.
What are just some of those like things that, if you were able to kind of just, share your thoughts and be like, "Hey, this is the reality," or here's what the big trucks need some help from you guys or something like that.
Back to the dimensions, like you were talking about, the biggest thing is we need accurate dimensions.
Hmm.
there's a lot of planning on a load like that. The main thing is just measure the piece. And if
Hmm.
you don't know how to measure it or you can't measure it yourself, get somebody to help you because the measurements are critical. I mean, a few inches make a huge difference when, especially in relation to height. You cannot be off on that. That has to be perfect. Another thing is a lot of people don't know how to read schematics. So like they'll get the schematics for a vessel. I haul a lot of vessels and tanks and things like that. They'll get the schematics for it and they'll look at it and it'll say, oh, well, the diameter is 15.6, but they don't look at the flanges that come off of it or the lifting eyes or all those things still add dimension. It doesn't matter that maybe it's only a half-inch wide strap that's the lifting eye. It still
Uh-huh.
adds dimension upwards, and that makes a difference because that may be the difference between you clearing a bridge and you not.
Yeah.
So,
Is there a level of tolerance or comfort? If you say I'm 18 high, are they like just gonna make sure that you've got 6 inches of clearance under every bridge and whatnot they send you under just for having a little buffer, or how does that? Is there a strategy there?
so it depends on the state, and it depends on whether you have route surveys or not. Texas usually gives us 4 to 5 inches. Some states give you more, some states give you less, and that's also the purpose of running a pole car when you're doing things. Is they may have paved the road and not reported
Yeah.
it to the state, or the state not put it in the system yet, and so you have to double check everything when it comes to extreme dimensions. Um, but there should be a tolerance. Most Texas bridges are about 6 inches higher than they're labeled. Um, I do not say that as an encouragement to buffer things, but
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
always try to add height too. So like if I'm 18 feet, then I'll permit it 18.2 just to give me a little extra buffer because maybe there'll be a weird transition in the road. And yeah, with a pole, it'll clear at 18 feet. But when you're 90 feet long, it may not clear because it may lift the load up as
Uh,
there's a dip underneath a bridge. I may be on the higher ends.
yeah, yeah.
So I always try to give it just a little bit extra, just to be safe. So there, hopefully, there's buffer on both sides. The state gives you buffer, and you give yourself buffer.
And a sign that's on a bridge, and if it says, it's 16 feet 5 inches, and it's a bridge that's not necessarily a flat one, right? But it's kind of a curved one. That 16 feet five, is that at the lowest point, above the roadway, or is that the highest point? Is that the average? How is that measured
It's
technically?
supposed to be the lowest point within the lanes.
Okay, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
it's not always measured that way, but most cases it's supposed to be the lowest point within the lane. So there'll be times I've actually had it called out on a permit where it tells you to be in the left lane at this point because the bridge curves at this
Hmm.
angle. So when it may be a foot taller in the left lane. And I've actually had that called out on a permit because there was no way around the bridge.
Uh-huh. Without
So
going incredibly
way out of route.
way
Yes, sir.
out of route, right? Right.
Yes, sir.
And that's I think that's a unique thing about this part of the trucking industry is that you can't just hop on Google Maps and be like, oh, from Memphis to to somewhere else, it's 3 hours by car and it's only 300 miles or something like that, right? You because the route that a pedestrian or a regular truck could go, that's not the route that a permitted load would be going on. You could be adding hours and hours and hours of extra travel time, compared to what a typical load could go on.
So an easy example is I loaded a 16.4 load out of Houston, and I went to Osceola, Arkansas. Um, if my memory is correct, it's like 600 miles straight line as far as a
Mhm.
normal car or truck would drive, and we traveled over 1,000 miles. We were fine in Texas. We ran east a little bit and we ran up and caught 59 and went to the border. But when we got to Arkansas, we had over 600 miles in just Arkansas. We would go up a little ways and then down a little ways and around this bridge, and man, we were back and forth zigzagging all across the state, and it adds a lot of time and mileage. What would be a normal day and a half trip turned into a 3 day trip just because it's slow moving. You've got to watch stop signs. You got stop signs. You've got small roads. There's times where you have to stop and let cars go by, and it's
Mhm.
just it can be very, very time consuming.
And so planning out exactly when you're going to arrive there in Arkansas 3 days later after navigating so many obstacles over 1,000 something miles, it's kind of hard to pinpoint and say, yes, I'll be there at 2 p.m. on Tuesday, right? So I guess maybe you're trying to shoot to just get nearby the day before or something like that. So there's a lot of buffer, I guess, that has to be kind of just planned in for these kinds of loads.
Yes, I always try to give myself buffer. I always, um, usually when I'm quoting a load, I'll try and figure out the route, especially if I have experience with that size or whatever. I'll go back and look at my route and see just kind of roughly what it took me. I have a really great permit guy. He will run through some routes with me if I don't know the area or if I haven't gone that dimension in that area, and I'll be like, hey, what route are we going to run so I can kind of get an idea as to where we're going to be, and then give that time because there's no way to pinpoint it. I mean, I can't say like, okay, I loaded 11 o'clock Monday. I will be there at exactly noon on Wednesday. There's no way to guarantee that.
And maybe a last one for folks that are in transportation. It's pretty common when you're giving pricing to somebody, and you'll say, "Hey, it's 200, it's $2.20 a mile," and they'll kind of be able to come up with a rate based on the miles and whatnot. But in this, it really, if you've got a really complex, humongous load that only needs to go 100 miles, it's not about the miles, right? And you might have 300 miles out of route you got to run. You might have all these permits and all this extra cost. So, what's kind of like a rule of thumb that people can use, whenever if they're ever quoting, a heavy haul load?
So there's two ways that I approach it. The main way that I approach it is by the day. You have to have your money right by the day, and a lot of pilot cars and stuff have gone to where they just charge flat day rates.
Hmm.
Um, you have to be able to cover that and still make a profit. I I believe in everybody making a profit from the business that you're hauling for, the brokerage, the drivers. Everybody needs to make money that's involved, or otherwise we're wasting our time and wearing equipment out for no reason.
Yeah.
Um, when you get to middle of the road oversized, more somewhat of what I do, a lot of it can be done by mileage. There there's kind of an argument there that everything oversized should be done day rate, but in the current economy, the current conditions we're in, that's not really an option. So um, the easiest way to figure it is a minimum of $1 a mile per axle, and then anything extra that you're charging, anything extra that you're doing. So if you're stretching your trailer, that's an extra charge of $2 a mile. If you have to run two pilot cars, that's $2 a mile per pilot car. And this is round numbers. This is not
Yeah. Right.
exact. And then
Right.
you have to add mileage, and you'll learn from the dimensions. If it's medium oversized per se, then maybe you add 30%. If it's tall, maybe add 50%. So
Talking
I'm talking
more.
about adding distance,
Oh, okay.
30% to 50% distance for
Okay.
your routing.
For the
Um,
routing, right? Okay.
yes, for the routing, and that and I always try to go with a round number. If the math comes out and it's $8,436, I'll do $8,500.
Sure.
And I try to bid everything just at even round numbers.
Yeah. Yeah.
It, it
Yeah.
makes it
Yeah.
it makes it easier, and that sometimes that may figure out to $30 a mile, but like you said, it's not really that straight line mileage. It may figure out to a big number, but it's not the route that you're going to run.
Whenever things don't go to plan, and for example, the crane got held up at a previous site, or the load wasn't ready, and so you drove a day to go pick this thing up. You get there and you're like, oh, sorry, we're not ready. The paint is still drying. You'll be ready tomorrow. What is that like for you as the driver? What kind of actions do you have to take, or costs involved with that when that happens?
So the biggest cost for me involved with oversized would be the pilot cars, because they're going to charge no goes and they're going to charge overnights and things like that. And it also has to be worth my time to sit there, because you're
Yeah.
whatever the situation is costing me money from making it to maybe my next load, because I may
Right.
have planned to haul a load from Texas to Virginia, and then Friday I'm going to load a load from Virginia back to Texas, and
Yeah.
now I can't make that Friday load, so now I've let that customer down, and
Yeah.
it just kind of snowballs really quickly. So you have to be willing to compensate for the time, and it's not just my time, it's everybody involved.
And like you said, there's that business loss and a possible customer relationship that you you're gonna have to call and say like, hey, I'm not gonna make it, to that pickup. Can we delay? Can we reschedule the crane or what? What? There's just a lot. It's just really complex.
It
Which is
is.
kind of what makes it interesting and fun, right? It's a little more stimulating of a part of the industry than LTL and full truckload is necessary. It's got to happen. It's what moves our economy. But the real fun problem solver type stuff is oversized for sure, right?
Yes, it is. And I enjoy it. That's part of what keeps me going in the industry is I enjoy the challenge of it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, hey, thanks for hopping on and talking with us a little bit today. I think there was a lot of knowledge probably that people were able to pick up and understand just kind of a little bit more what it's like to be, behind the wheel. And also, I think I got maybe some appreciation for, just the occupation and the career of driving and that it's an expertise and that some people have known how to shift a shift since they were 4 years old and I still do. So, so thanks for making me feel really good about myself on that one. But hey, appreciate you coming on. Any last parting words from your side?
Well, thank you for having me. I'm always looking to share information and being able to pass on this information. It's not so much even the younger generation, like I was talking about earlier. There's people that have been in this industry for 20 years that don't understand how oversized works, and to be able to get that information out there, applied information is power, and and I think that there's a lot of people that aren't willing to share their information, and people have been willing to freely share that information with me, and I would like to do so for people who are wanting to learn, even if they're never a part of it. At least they can understand what we do and how and why we do it.
For sure. All right. Thanks, Stetson.
Thank you, Nathan. Have a good one.